Welcome back for another video about the Make Noise Rene 2. Today we are going to be creating a bass line. Alright, so before we start talking about the Rene and our bass line, we need to talk about the kick. And the reason why is that most of the time when you're creating a bass line, you want to design your bass line around your kick. You don't have to, but this is the way that a lot of electronic beat-based music works, and you'll probably find good results if you do. So to start, to keep things off simple, I'm using here the Roland TR-8S. Love this machine. It's a really fun drum machine. You don't have to have this particular one. Really, any drum machine that you have that lets you sequence a kick, or any group of eurorack modules that lets you do the same thing is perfectly fine. All right, so I've gone ahead and I have pre-programmed my drum machine to have a 4 on the floor pattern. That basically means we're going to have a kick on each of the quarter notes, which on my machine is 1, 5, 9, and 13 if you have those same labels. This is a really common drum pattern. I'm sure you've heard this on thousands of songs. Anyways, that's a very basic one. The reason why I'm starting with the kick is because as we do our bass line, effectively what we want is we want the bass line to fill the space that the kick is not. So when the kick hits, we don't want a bass line, and then when the kick is not hitting is when we want to fill in the bass line. Okay, so now turning a little bit to the Rene, one of the questions is how do we make Rene function or play some notes for our bass line when the kick is not hitting? There's a couple of ways to do this, but let me start by, I'm going to patch a clock that is a quarter note into my X channel. Now a quarter note clock basically means that each quarter note here, we're going to get a sound. And obviously that's not what we want, because those notes are falling right on the kick. So the first thing is, if you want to fill this space when something is not happening, you need to double your clock rate. So instead of a quarter note, I'm going to change here. I'm going to repatch into an 8th note. Now we have twice as many notes, and the thing that we need to do is that we need to subtract some of them. So I'm going to use the arrow keys, and I'm going to come over here to gate. Now, what gate does is if the push point is lit, it will fire a gate when the sequencer visits that knob, and if it is not lit, then it won't. So there, you can see that even though we're passing in an 8th note gate, because we have turned off every other gate here on the gate page, we're only getting what sounds like quarter notes. Now there you notice that something changed. Alright, so here's the third thing. The first thing was you have to double your clock signal. The second thing is that you need to use gates to omit the parts that you don't want. And the third thing is you notice that when I press start and stop, we're getting really different results, right? And the reason why is if you watch where the knob color lands, you'll hear that when I start it up again, we're going to get a different effect. So here you can hear the notes are on the same beat because we had stopped here, but if I stop here, the next time I start it, what we have is an offbeat bass. Now obviously, you don't want to have a situation where every time you press start and stop on whatever your master clock is that you have to pay attention to what your knob position is. There's a couple of ways to solve this in Rene. I'm not going to go over all of them. I'm going to show you the one that I typically use, which is, once again, if we change the page over here to the one that says fun, this is function, there's a bunch of different things, and if you look really close at the screened on text, you can see this one says fun mod. So everything in this row is what will happen if we get control voltage to the mod input, and the first one here is reset. Now what that will do is every time Rene sees a control voltage here to X mod, it will reset the position. Oh, you can see it already did it. It will reset the position of the sequence to this bottom left one. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to patch on my mutant brains. This is sequence start. So in other words, when I press start on my drum machine, that's what I'll get. There are other modules that also have a start voltage out that you could use. And I will patch that into Xmod. And now you will see, oh, let me fix the cabling here. These right angle cables I like because they stay out of your way, but you have to be a little bit more conscientious about how you put them in. So I'm going to go back here to gate. And you notice that every time I press start now, something slightly unexpected happens, which is if you watch, the cursor will jump back to this knob, but then there will be immediately a clock tick that will move it to this knob. Watch. So it's almost like when we do reset that we're starting here. And I'm going to be honest, this is a little annoying. This bugs me. Rene was not made to be, I think, a traditional sequencer. It's made for a little bit more experimental stuff. We're doing something traditional here, and so we have to sort of adapt. Now, there's a really easy way to adapt, which is we'll just invert our gates. You may have noticed that solves most of our problems, but it introduces a new one, which is when the reset happens, because this gate is now lit, we'll get a note right there at the start, and then the rest of the sequence will be offbeat like we expect. So it's up to you whether that's going to bother you or not. In my case, I just kind of leave it because it's not that big of a deal. So anyways, we've got Rene set up so that the rhythm is correct. We at least now have pitches that are filling that space where the kick is not. Let's go ahead and tune a couple of other things to make this sound pretty good. So I'm going to go over here to quantization. And it's up to you what pitch you pick here. I'm going to pick, I'm just going to pick one. I'm going to pick F, and I'm going to leave it at 2 octaves, and I'll show you why in a second. So you want to make sure that the 2 is lit. Okay. All right, so let's adjust the sound a little bit. Right now, you can see I've just got, I'm using the Studio Electronics Tonestar 8106 for this, by the way. I've just got the saw turned up, but let's go ahead and I'm going to turn up the sub all the way. And I'll turn up the square wave. Okay, so we're getting somewhere. Let's adjust the filter a little bit. Now on this I can add some drive or some high pass. What I really want though is because we have a square wave that we're using, I want some pulse width modulation. So that sound, and I'm going to bring up a little bit there. This is my envelope amount. And then this one is, there's an LFO going down here. That's what the white knobs are. And how much will it affect the filter? So if I turn it up, it's kind of crazy, but otherwise it'll slowly drift the filter up and down. So one thing to think about as you're doing this bass is how long the bass note lasts. So that would be like your, right, that's obviously too much. Adjusting the resonance right now. You can hear that pulse width modulation a lot now. It might be too much. There we go. Now one other thing you want to think about as you're doing this is because we have a bass line that we're alternating with our kick, the name for this by the way is offbeat bass, you want to think about your decay on your kick. So here's the decay on the kick all the way down. Here it is, I'm bringing it up. So you can hear we've got a lot of, kind of hangs around for a while. We want to adjust that so that they feel a bit more balanced. All right, and lastly, In terms of sound design, one thing that could be fun is to toss a little bit of delay on your... So right now, what this knob here is the effect send. It's sending a small amount into magneto. Alright, this is kind of cool, right? There's a couple of other things that we can do here. One is, you remember over here on the quantization page, I left it at 2 octaves. The reason why is because something we can do, you don't have to be in gate. Something we can do here is that now, because we have said there's one pitch, and the pitch is F, but we can do it in 2 octaves. If the knob is to the left, we'll hit the lower, and if the knob is to the right, we'll hit the higher. So we can kind of play around with that. So watch. Bring this down an octave. It's kind of cool. That's too clicky. All right, so you get the idea there. What are some other cool things that we can do? Well, there's another idea. The thing that we've been talking about now, up to this point, has been the offbeat bass. But there's another thing we can do that's fairly simple, and that is a driving bass or a rolling bass. And the idea behind this is it's a little bit different. So again, going back to our kick. Oh, I don't want that going. Going back to our kick, instead of saying, what we've been doing here is we've been putting our bass line on effectively these notes here, these ones that I'm touching. What if instead of that we put 16th notes and we filled all of this with hitting the bass line, except we omitted the spot that the kick was? So in order to do that, we're going to need to bring up our clock speed. So I am going to bring up Rene. I'm going to patch it in with a 16th clock. I'm going to bring all of our gates back in. Let's bring this up a bit. Okay, so that's a bit much. So one of the first things we're going to need is we want that to be a little bit more plucky so that we can hear the difference between notes. So I'm going to bring down the release a bit. Okay, so it's pretty close already. Get that tuned in. That's pretty cool. Play with that more in a second. Okay, so now remember we have this thing where whenever we stop it, it's going to jump to here, and then the first clock beat is going to go here. So the one that we want to turn off, normally it would be this, because this is when our kick is hitting, but now we'll turn off that one. Now we can do some fun stuff here. Again, because we have limited ourselves to one pitch, this row here will always be when our kick is hitting, but we can decide to do whatever we want with the rest of this. A common technique is to, so the hit will be here, here, and here, because it'll be kick, bassline, bassline, bassline. So a common thing to do is actually to bring up that middle one to be the next octave up. bring in a saw instead of the square wave. You can see it just gives it a little bit of a different sound.